1950, the Korean War broke out between the North Koreans and the South Koreans. Just 2 days after this war had begun, the United States formally entered the conflict by sending troops to aid the South Koreans. Shortly after this, the United States enacted a military draft. A military draft is the forced enlistment of civilians into the military. In the Korean War, the way Americans were chosen was in a lottery, and if their name was called, they would have to stop whatever they were doing in the civilian world and immediately go serve their country. And if they refused, they would go to jail. An 18-year-old high school dropout nicknamed Samson was living with his family in Seattle, Washington when he found out he had been drafted. While military service was not something Samson was considering for his future, he accepted his fate with grace, and before long, he was making his way to Fort Ord in Northern California to begin his military training. But after training, when Samson was now officially a soldier in the army, he was not sent to Korea to fight in the war. Instead, he was ordered to stay at Fort Ord and be the lifeguard for their pool. It's unclear how Samson felt about this, but regardless, he did his duty, and he stayed at this pool and he minded the folks who went swimming, and then at night and on the weekends, he would earn some extra cash by being a bouncer at a local bar. A year later, Samson was still working at the Fort Ord pool when he decided to take some time off and go back home to Seattle and see his family and see his girlfriend. As a military member, Samson was able to fly for free on any military flight so long as he was in uniform. And so Samson packed up his things, he threw on his uniform, and he made his way over to the Fort Ord airport, where he hopped on a small military plane and he flew to Seattle. A few days later, on September 30th, 1951, Samson said goodbye to his family and to his girlfriend, and then he put his uniform back on and made his way to the Seattle airport. When he got there, he saw there was only one military plane that was flying from Seattle all the way down to Fort Ord, and this plane was a World War II era dive bomber that only had enough space for one person, the pilot. Samson had to get back to Fort Ord that night because the following day he had work, and in the army you can't just not show up for work. But Samson didn't have enough money to buy a civilian plane ticket to take a civilian flight down to Fort Ord. So he was in a tough spot. And so he approaches this pilot of this dive bomber plane and he says, "Hey, can I just cram into your radar compartment in the back of your plane?" And the pilot, whose name was Anderson, immediately said, "No, that's a terrible idea. It's not meant for passengers. It's barely big enough to fit inside of. You could get badly hurt in there." But Samson was adamant that he had to get back that night, that he'd be in so much trouble if he didn't. And he kind of appealed to Anderson and said, "Look, you're in the military. You get it. I have to get back there tonight. Can you please make an exception and just let me hitch a ride in the back of your plane?" And so finally, against his better judgment, Anderson caves and he says, "Okay, Samson, you can come with me." And so a little bit before 4 p.m. that afternoon, Samson eagerly went around to the side of the plane. He opened up a side hatch and he crawled inside of this very tight radar compartment. And once he was tucked up inside, Anderson walked around and he closed the hatch behind him. And then Anderson got in the cockpit and began preparing the plane for takeoff. A few minutes later, the pair was careening down the runway, and right as the plane began to experience lift and was going up into the air, the side hatch of the radar compartment where Samson was suddenly flew open. The big issue with this now open door in the radar compartment was not that Samson, like in the movies, would get sucked out this door out to his death, although if he wasn't careful, he totally could fall out of the door. No, the real problem with this now open door had to do with oxygen levels. At their cruising altitude, where the majority of their flight would be spent, there wasn't enough oxygen in the air to sustain human life. And so as soon as Anderson powered up that plane and began preparing it for takeoff, he began pumping oxygen into the cockpit and also into the radar compartment space. This is done specifically to compensate for the lack of oxygen up at that cruising altitude. But with Samson's door now wide open, all that extra oxygen that was coming into that space to keep him alive is now just being sucked right out the door into the atmosphere, which meant if Samson couldn't find a way to shut that door, he would eventually pass out and suffocate to death. Samson, who was fully aware of this fact, immediately jumped into action by anchoring his feet and legs around the stanchion in the middle of this compartment space, and once he was fairly secure, he began extending his upper body out of the plane to try to grab onto the handle to try to shut it. But once he was holding onto that door handle, he's now halfway out of the plane, he could not get it to shut. The wind was so strong it was pinning the door open. And so for the next several minutes, Samson desperately is trying to get this this door shut, but it's not working. And so eventually he retreated back into the plane and went all the way to the very back of the radar compartment space and tucked himself up behind some equipment. Because this was not an area where passengers were supposed to be, there was no way to communicate with the pilot. He could not tell Anderson that he was dying back here. And so he just sat there and prayed. While Samson was dealing with this open door crisis, Anderson was dealing with a crisis of his own. At some point after takeoff, he looked down at his gauges and he realized a terrible mistake had been made. There wasn't enough fuel to get to Fort Ord, and where he was discovering it, where he was out over the water, there wasn't enough fuel to even turn around and go back to Seattle. And so Anderson grabs his radio and he tries to call out to these surrounding airports to see if there's anywhere he can just emergency land this plane, but all he hears is silence. It would turn out his radio equipment just happened to fail right at this moment. And what also happened to fail right at that moment was Anderson's oxygen supply. It had nothing to do with Samson and the open door. Anderson just also suddenly was without oxygen. And so Anderson knew he had to get to a lower altitude as fast as possible because he would eventually pass out and crash the plane. And so he went into a very steep dive and began going down and realized he needed to try to land this plane in the ocean now. There was no way he could get to an airport. And so he's burning down towards the water, and as they're coming down in altitude, there was more oxygen in the air. And so Samson, who had eventually passed out from a lack of oxygen, is suddenly revived with all this additional oxygen as they're going down. And so Samson comes to and he looks and the door is still wide open and all he can see is the Pacific Ocean burning up at him. He only had a few seconds to grab onto the stanchion in the middle of the space he's in before they impacted the water. Miraculously, Samson survived the impact, but immediately he was faced with another life and death situation. Because this door was wide open, the freezing cold water began pouring inside, flooding the space. And so Samson tried to swim his way out, but the power of this water coming in was too strong, and so he had to wait until the space completely flooded before he swam out and then swam up to the surface. Once he got to the surface, he's looking around and the water's incredibly choppy and it's very foggy. He can barely see anything. And he's looking around for Anderson, not really sure what happened to him, and he looks down the plane towards the front of the plane and he sees Anderson climbing out of the cockpit. He looks badly beaten up, but he's alive. He's okay. And so Samson yells to him and the two men link up and they're able to pull two life rafts out of the plane. And so both men, they get into each of their rafts right as this plane sinks down below the surface. And so Anderson and Samson begin looking around wondering what they're going to do, but it's so foggy they can't see land in any direction. They can barely see 10 feet away from themselves. And so Anderson thought they landed maybe 2 or 3 miles off the coast of California, but they weren't really sure. So Anderson pulled out his compass, he looked east and said, let's just start paddling. The men had crashed about 2 miles off the coast of Point Reyes, California, which is this big protected shoreline that's about 150 miles north of Fort Ord. And this particular stretch of water that these two men had found themselves in was a known breeding ground for great white sharks. So the two men, they got their compass and they're trying to swim as fast as they can to the east, but they're not seeing any land. The fog hasn't let up at all. And then eventually it got dark. And as soon as it got dark, the water got choppier and choppier until at one point, Samson actually was launched out of his raft into the water. He turned around and saw his raft, but it was being pulled away by a current faster than he could swim to it. And so Samson yells out for Anderson, who sees him in the water. Anderson tries his best to paddle over and save Samson, but the current was too strong. And before long, Samson watched as Anderson just disappeared into the fog. Now, Samson was all alone in the middle of the night. He couldn't see anything. There's no land anywhere. He doesn't have the compass. Anderson had the compass, so he has no idea which direction is what. He's in a shark breeding ground, and now he doesn't have his life raft. And so Samson did the only thing he could do, which was pick a direction that he believed was east and start swimming. And so Samson is swimming in this pitch black water. He can't see anything around him. And all he's probably thinking about is how any minute now, I'm going to run out of energy and I'm going to sink down and I'm going to drown, or I'm going to get attacked by sharks, or some combination of the two. But miraculously, after about an hour of swimming in some direction, he broke through the fog and he saw way off in the distance was a light on what looked like dry land. And so he has this sudden burst of energy and he swims as hard and as fast as he possibly can. A couple of times he gets pulled under by by rip currents and he nearly drowns, but eventually he gets to the sandy shores of Point Reyes. It's believed he swam approximately 1 or 2 miles after being dumped out of the boat. As he was pulling himself out of the water and collapsed on the beach, he had given everything to that swim. Had he been in the water for even a few more minutes, it's very likely he would have drowned. Unable to stand from pure exhaustion, Samson just began slowly crawling up the beach towards this light he had seen as he was swimming. And it would turn out this light was on the outside of this building that was owned by a radio station. And so Samson is crawling and periodically puking out seawater. And finally, after about 30 or 45 minutes, he gets to the steps of this building. He crawls up the steps and he pounds on the door. And by this point, he's hypothermic, he's in shock. He's about to die if he doesn't get any help. And luckily, there's someone inside of this building. They open it up, they see Samson. They don't know what's going on, but they pick him up, they pull him inside, they wrap him in a blanket, and they try to ask him, what happened? What's going on? Why are you here? But Samson was too cold to even speak, so he just sat there and shook. And so finally, this employee just called the Coast Guard that had a station very close to where they were. And a few minutes later, the Coast Guard shows up, they take Samson, and they rush him to their station house where they were able to give him medical treatment, which saved his life. It was also at this Coast Guard station where Samson was reunited with Anderson, who had also managed to make his way to shore alive. Samson would go on to serve for 2 more years in the Army. The entire time was spent as a lifeguard at the Fort Ord Pool. Then in 1953, after the Korean War ended, Samson's mandatory service came to an end and he was honorably discharged. Samson would go on to become one of the most successful and well-known actors and producers of all time. He has won hundreds of big awards, including 4 Academy Awards and 4 Golden Globe Awards. Samson's real name is Clint Eastwood. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please open all the cans of tuna fish in the like button's pantry and then proceed to let loose a vicious gang of feral cats in their house. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise, so if you want to buy flannels and hats and a whole bunch of stuff, go to shopmrballen.com. Also, go follow our shop's Instagram page for all upcoming deals and promotions. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Small Japanese island about 500 miles south of the Japanese mainland. During World War II, the Japanese put a base on this island and they put 2 radio towers at the top of the 2 mountains on the island. These radio towers became integral to the Japanese communication and surveillance operations in the Pacific during the war. And so at that time, the island was heavily fortified with up to 25,000 troops and huge anti-aircraft guns. Because of the island's obvious strategic value to Japan, the Americans wanted to take it from them. But American military strategists advised against that, saying that any amphibious landing of this island would result in massive casualties for Americans, and the Japanese would likely just repel the attack anyways. And so the Americans decided to go with the next best thing, which was to attempt to bomb the 2 towers and cut out their communications. So in June of 1944, American aircraft carriers, which are those huge ships that planes can take off of and land on, they headed for the island of Chichijima. And once the island was completely surrounded, the Americans began launching their pilots to try to take out these towers. But the Japanese fought back in a major way. And despite taking heavy casualties on their side, they repelled every American air raid and kept them from bombing their towers. After several months of these failed missions over Chichijima, the American military leaders were incredibly frustrated. They knew this was going to be a difficult mission, but they didn't expect it to be this difficult. However, this island was so strategically important that the Americans knew they had to just keep on sending pilots in until they took out these towers. And so in September of that year, the Americans were back to planning another raid over Chichijima Island, and one of the pilots selected to go on this particular raid was a 20-year-old named George, who actually was the youngest pilot in the United States Navy at the time. But despite his age, he'd actually flown in several combat missions already and had actually been shot down already and had to eject into the ocean and was subsequently rescued. On the morning of this raid, George, along with his two-man crew, which was his radio operator named Dell and his door gunner named Ted, they boarded the plane, and then at 7:15 a.m., George and his crew took off, along with dozens of other American aircraft that were part of this operation. George immediately climbed above 8,000 feet because that would put them outside of anti-aircraft gun range. And so the way this mission would work is all these pilots would fly over the island, and then in order to drop their bombs, they would have to dive down below 8,000 feet and then manually drop their bombs and then try to get back up above 8,000 feet and out away from the island. And so George had run missions like this before, and so he was one of the first to actually make that dive down to the island. And as soon as he went below 8,000 feet, the island just erupted with anti-aircraft gun fire. And so all these rounds are coming up, flak is popping all over the place, and George almost immediately notices the side of his plane gets hit. But the plane's stable enough that he decides he's just going to keep on diving down and complete the mission. And he's yelling back to Ted and to Dell to hold on, and they get all the way down to 3,000 feet when George releases two 500-pound bombs that are direct hits on the radio tower he was assigned to bomb. But at this point, George's plane is now engulfed in flames. It can barely fly, and so George is again yelling at Ted and Dell to hold on. He's pulling back on the lever, and he begins to turn himself away from the tower out towards the water, and he manages to fly away from the island, but he can feel the plane starting to go down. Now, George had previously been shot down before, and what he learned from that is how important it was to fly as far away from the enemy as you possibly can before you bail out of your plane. Because if you bail too early and you land in the water right near where the enemy is, you'll just get captured. And so George was holding on to that lever and keeping his plane up as long as he possibly could. And so he's flying and getting lower and lower and lower and closer to the water, and Ted and Dell are yelling at him that they gotta jump out. Meanwhile, outside, the other planes that had sustained damage, the other American planes, their crews are already bailing out. But George is saying, no, hold on. And he keeps going farther and farther until he's so close to the water that it's practically too late. And then he gives the order to jump out of the plane. George abandons his controls. He leaps out the door and he hits his head on the back of the plane as he leaps out. But his chute would open up right before he hit the water and it would save his life. As soon as George hits the water and he comes up for air, he's under his parachute. And so he's trying to get his parachute away to get a breath of air. He disconnects his parachute from his shoulders. He clears the parachute and he's looking around and he sees his plane that is now being flown by no one go crashing directly into the water. And so immediately he's looking around for Ted and Dell's parachute to make sure they're okay, but he doesn't see any parachutes anywhere. However, George notices a life raft from his plane had miraculously just landed like 10 feet away from him. So he swims over to the life raft, he climbs inside, and once he's in there, all he's thinking about is Ted and Dell. So he's yelling for Ted, he's yelling for Dell, but he's not getting a response. And so George turns around in the raft. So now he's facing towards the island, and to his horror, way off on the horizon, right near the edge of this island, are Japanese patrol boats that are speeding in his direction. He knows they're coming to get him and the other people that had jumped out of these planes. And so George turns back around, he leaps onto his chest on the front of this raft, and he starts using his hands to swim as fast as he can away from this island. The whole time he's screaming out for Ted and Dell in hopes he's going to find them. Little did he know that both of them had not survived the crash. One had not even jumped out of the plane and had died on impact, and the other had jumped out, but their parachute had not inflated. And so George is swimming as fast as he possibly can, and he's yelling out for Dell and for Ted, and he's looking, but he doesn't hear them, he doesn't see them, and he knows that not only is he not going to find his friends, but there's just no way he's going to outswim these boats. And so at some point, he just turns around and sits in the raft, and he's looking towards these patrol boats, and he knows that at some point they're going to come up here and they're going to capture him. And all he can think about is how guilty he feels about Ted and Del. And he starts second guessing his decision to keep that plane flying as long as he did and make them bail out so late. And he's thinking, I probably got them killed. And then he thought about his wife, and he wondered if he'd ever see her again. And then he turned towards these Japanese boats that were much closer now, but still fairly far away, and he began mentally preparing himself for captivity. But before he could be captured, American aircraft come storming in overhead, and they go flying past him towards the island, and they start dropping bombs and strafing these Japanese boats that were coming out to get George. And so George is thinking, oh my goodness, what luck. He turns around, he gets back on his chest, and he starts swimming as fast as he can, trying to get away, knowing that these boats are totally preoccupied with the aircraft overhead. And for 2 hours, George used every ounce of strength he had to swim as far as he possibly could away from this island. But at some point, he was just so unbelievably exhausted, he just could not paddle any farther. And so he's just laying on this raft when he hears the sound of something coming out of the water, and he turns and he sees the periscope of an American submarine coming out of the water. And seconds later, the crew of this American submarine comes right up alongside him. They grab him out of the raft, they put him in the submarine, and he was saved. Besides George, Ted, and Del, there were 8 other American airmen that had to bail out of their aircraft because they were badly damaged following this raid. And so originally, those 8 people were not recovered, and they were believed to have drowned at sea. But that actually was not true. The US government figured out fairly quickly what happened to them, but the details of what happened to them were so gruesome, the government decided they did not want to tell anyone. They especially didn't want to tell the parents and loved ones of these 8 airmen because they believed if they heard the true account, that would be too traumatic for them. And so they made the details of these 8 deaths totally top secret. But 60 years later, in 2004, an author named James Bradley discovered transcripts from a post-World War II Japanese war crimes trial held in Guam, where Japanese military leaders confessed to what they did to these 8 captured Americans. This is the true account. Unlike George, these 8 other airmen bailed out almost immediately after they got out over the water. And so that placed them in the water very close to the island. And so before the American aircraft could come in and save the day, like they did with George, these 8 airmen were scooped up by the Japanese and brought back to the island. The Japanese soldiers on this island for the past several months have been getting constantly bombed by American aircraft, inflicting a very high casualty rate. And so these soldiers hated the Americans, and they wanted revenge against the Americans. And so suddenly you have these 8 American prisoners on this island with no one to protect them. And so what do you think happens? The Japanese decide they're going to exact their revenge on these 8 men. Within 24 hours of being captured, the 8 men were kind of huddled up in one section of the island when one of them, Marv Mershon, who was 19 from Long Beach, California, was grabbed by a Japanese commander, stood up and moved to the central area within their military camp, and they tied him to a tree, and this commander encouraged all of the other soldiers to beat and kick Marv. And so all day long, soldiers were coming up and just beating the crap out of Marv, and Marv is tied to the tree. He can't do anything. And these 7 other prisoners are forced to just watch because they can't do anything. And so that night, the same commander comes back and he unties Marv from the tree, and he tells these 7 other prisoners to stay where they are. And this commander and several other Japanese soldiers, they take Marv and they march him away from the group into the jungle, and they march him over to this freshly dug grave. And standing next to the grave that Marv would have seen is this Japanese soldier carrying a sword. And so Marv is told to walk up to the edge of this grave. They tell him to kneel down in front of this grave, and they let him smoke a final cigarette. And apparently Marv very calmly smoked the cigarette, and when he was done, the man with the sword put a blindfold on Marv and then told Marv to extend his neck. And as soon as he did, he was beheaded. Afterwards, they buried him inside of this grave. That night, one of the high-ranking Japanese generals on the island, a man named Yoshio Tachibana, who was an alcoholic and was notorious for his sadistic tendencies with prisoners, he was sitting around drinking, having a good time, when he decided that his soldiers soldiers, they needed to prove they had what he called the fighting spirit. And the only way they could show they had this fighting spirit was by consuming human flesh. And so Tachibana ordered his soldiers to go exhume Marv from his shallow grave, and then Tachibana sent over one of his surgeons, and he told him to remove Marv's thigh. So the surgeon goes over, he surgically removes Marv's thigh, he gives it to one of the cooks, and the cooks, they make this huge meal using Marv's thigh, and they serve it to Tachibana and his other high-ranking officers and some soldiers. And apparently, Marv's thigh tasted so good with soy sauce and with sake that Tachibana ordered his soldiers to go back and cut more meat off of Marv, which they did. Within a month of Marv's execution and consumption, Tachibana decided that he wanted to eat more human flesh, and he wanted his soldiers to eat more human flesh because he and a number of the other officers were superstitious that this could make them stronger and it would be good for their stomach and it would be good for their health. And so they decide they're going to kill more of the American prisoners and eat them. And so they brought the 7 remaining American prisoners out to the rifle range. And once they were all out there, one of the Japanese officers grabbed 25-year-old Floyd Hall from Missouri. They pulled him out of the group and they walked him over to the middle of this range and they tied him to a wooden stake in the ground. And once he was in place, Tachibana, who was there, he ordered the other Japanese soldiers to work on their bayonet work on Floyd Hall. And so one by one, these soldiers would go up and plunge their bayonets into Floyd Hall's chest, into his stomach, until he ultimately died. Once he was dead, Tachibana, who had brought along his surgeons for this very reason, he sent them out to remove Floyd's liver and his gallbladder right in front of the now 6 living prisoners. They're watching this happen right in front of them. And then once his liver and gallbladder have been removed and wrapped in cellophane paper to preserve them, the surgeons walked back and stood on the edge because they knew this was not the last execution of the day. And so the other 6 prisoners are looking around, wondering what's next. And then one of the commanders walks over and he grabs another one of the prisoners. His name was Earl Vaughn. He was 22 years old from Texas. And as soon as he was grabbed, he knew he did not want to face the same fate Floyd did. And so right away, he became defiant. He wanted to die more quickly. And so he began yelling Semper Fi at the Japanese. And he kept extending his neck and pointing up at his neck, indicating he wanted a clean and quick death. Behead me. And so the Japanese, they tried to strap him to this wooden post because they wanted the other soldiers to work on their bayonets with him, but it was just too difficult with Earl. He put up such a fight and he kept putting his neck out that finally one of the soldiers did pull him down and he was beheaded. And then again, the surgeons came running out into the field, and in plain sight of the now 5 remaining American captives, they removed Earl's liver and his gallbladder and then wrapped them in cellophane paper to preserve them. And then they took Floyd and Earl's organs and they went back to the cooks to have them prepared. And that night, all the high-ranking officers on the island feasted on Earl and Floyd. Within a few days of Floyd and Earl's murders, the other 5 captives were also executed in a similar fashion, one by one, in front of their comrades. And 2 of those remaining 5 were also consumed. And unfortunately, one of those 2 was not executed beforehand. Instead, they had pieces of their body surgically amputated, and then those pieces would get cooked and eaten. And when they were done eating them, they would just come back and cut off more and more and more until there was nothing left to eat. And at that point, that prisoner was executed. They did this in order to keep their meat fresh. After the war was over, 34 Japanese soldiers, including General Tachibana, were tried for war crimes for their atrocities they committed against these 8 prisoners of war. They were all found guilty and they were all hanged and buried in unmarked graves in Guam. The other men on the island that witnessed these atrocities and didn't do anything about it, or participated but in some sort of secondary way, they were also tried for war crimes, found guilty, and sent to jail, but all of them were released after 8 years. George was 80 years old when he finally learned about the atrocities on Chichijima Island that he so narrowly escaped. He, like everyone else that was learning about this, was horrified and disturbed, but more than anything, George felt a deep sense of guilt for having survived. But what we can all say for sure is that George did not waste his second chance at life. George H.W. Bush would go on to become the 41st president of the United States of America. And his son, also named George Bush, would go on to become the 43rd president of the United States of America. Two world leaders who would change the course of history forever, who never would have been if George Sr. had bailed out of that plane near Chichijima Island just a few seconds earlier. Think about that. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's hand sanitizer with lubricant right before they head out to do some errands. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. We are now selling merch like this flannel, like this hat, and you can buy some of your own at shopmrballen.com. You can also check out our Instagram page called Shop Mr. Ballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all 3 of them hopped inside and then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist, he had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and doing whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, hey, I want to give you something. And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, no, I want you to have them. And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox. And so Sean is like, I can't accept these two things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. What's going on here? But Bryce would just say, look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you. And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim. At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They had just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus, Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely. He's abusing drugs and alcohol. And I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on. And she says, okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me. And so they hang up. And before Karen can even call Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend. And she says to Karen, hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him. It's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off. And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, would you please put my son on the phone? Bryce picks up the phone and he says, hey mom, and he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, what's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely and, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here? And Bryce would tell his mom that, look mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset. And, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment, but she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave? But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well. And it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing independent of one another. And so she says, you know what, Bryce, look, I want you to just stay there and I'm going to fly out there first thing tomorrow morning and I'm going to just see what's going on out there. And at this, Bryce immediately says, no, mom, I have a lot to talk to you about. And until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here. And so Karen's like, what do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand. But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead she put her husband on the phone. And he asked Bryce, hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? And your mom tells me there's some problem. Like, what's going on here? And Bryce again just reiterates, look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now. And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave. And so Kim says, okay, I'll give him his keys. And then they hung up. And then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem, I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment. And Karen and Mike are totally relieved and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car insurance company letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought, we need to call the police because something horrible has happened. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him, and let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements, and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier, and it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna Niguel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna Niguel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone, and so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who worked there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair. He's got a tattoo on his arm. He's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh, yeah, we saw him a couple of hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop, and we drove to that rest stop, and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop. And he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot, and there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheel, staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side and he looks down to get Bryce's attention, and Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up, and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down and Christian says to him, hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You got to talk to them. And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, hey, he is still here. Here he is. And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says hello, Karen's like, what are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you. And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. And so finally his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please. And Bryce says, okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now. And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off. Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip. And so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, the police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrive in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass, and Bryce rolls the window down, and the officer would say Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he passed all of them. He even said, hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here. And so the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol. There was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, what are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you. Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay. And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. And he said, hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom. And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out. He dialed his mother's number and he hit call. And the officer said, give me the phone. So Bryce hands over the phone. The officer picks it up. Karen answers the phone. And the officer tells her, hey, look, I'm with your son. He's just fine. He's sober. There's no drugs. There's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's going to go home pretty soon. But there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on. And so he hands the phone over to Bryce. Bryce picks it up, and Karen says to him, what's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic, and she told her son very gently, Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. Drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just got to drive home. You got to leave Buttonwillow. You got to come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer, who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier. And he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her. And so he was calling back, and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely? Because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no, after you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot, but, the police actually were just over there. They checked on him, and now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what? I'm confident he's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here. And, if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time, Christian pulls up right next to him, he parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. It's the third time he's seen this car repairman, and Christian says to him, hey, Bryce, you need to go home. Your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home. And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, okay, yeah, all right, let's leave. And so Christian gets back in his car, and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot, and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back. And he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. And then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone. He's still driving. And Karen tells him, okay, you're going to give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home. But Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, I can't see anything out my window. It's too dark and I don't know where anything is. And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you, Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home. You can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point, and it's the middle of the night, so it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, okay, pull over, but as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road. So Bryce says, no problem, I'll do that. And they hang up. Several hours later at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here. He's finally arrived, thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up, and it's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car? And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank and they say, yes, our son Bryce drives that car. The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. I mean, they looked everywhere for days and days and days. But nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough, it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up this small access road until it reached a truck stop. And then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. That was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up his scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive, that after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge, he goes up to the truck stop, and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. And still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all this strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff, and perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was he said he needed to talk to his mom about. That thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was. Since August 30th, 2013, when Bryce went missing, no one has heard from him and no one has seen him. If you think you have information about Bryce Laspisa, please call this number now. Let them know what you know, because his parents, volunteers, the police, there's so many people still looking for him. And so any bit of information could crack this case. So please, if you have information, call this number below. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to help the like button pack up all their things so they can move, but only use weak and old tape so the bottom of the moving boxes falls out as soon as anyone tries to lift them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.